mesh generation in a CFD design optimization cycle. So just covering the motivation and background behind the work I'm presenting. So as most of you would know, mesh generation is a key pre-processing step in a CFD design cycle. And generally, when there's an update to the geometry in the cycle, you also need to perform the mesh generation again. This could be a problem for cases with very large meshes in cells in millions or higher, because the runtime of the mesh generation could rival that of the solver itself, and that makes it a significant bottleneck in most of these analysis cycles. This is despite the fact that many mesh generation tools are parallelized. In our case, we're looking at OpenFOAM Snappy Hex Mesh, which uses MPI to reduce runtimes and employs dynamic load balancing to deal with the increasing mesh size. Looking at it more in depth, when you start off with a standard OpenFOAM case, you generally create a standard block mesh using the block mesh utility. And prior to performing mesh generation using Snappy Hex Mesh in parallel, you first decompose that mesh across 4 cores, across a given number of cores. In this example, we're looking at 4 cores decomposed using the hierarchical geometric decomposition method. After the initial mesh is decomposed, then you run Snappy Hex Mesh, and its 3 phases, namely refinement, snapping, and layering. Refinement or castellation is the one that introduces the most amount of cells into the mesh, and so it needs to perform a lot of dynamic load balancing after almost every other iteration, or almost every iteration of its run, to deal with the increasing mesh size due to the cell splitting. So in this example, you can see that the geometric decomposition has changed quite a bit from the initial mesh to post-refinement, with many of the cells that were originally on processor 0 in gray here have now moved into processor 1 along with the cells that originated from it. The snapping phase does not introduce more cells, so it doesn't need to perform dynamic load balancing. And the layering phase does introduce cells, but only really performs load balancing right at the end. The other aspect to understand about load balancing with Snappy Hex Mesh is the decomposition methods. Here we look at the decomposition methods in the ESI release of OpenFOAM. So this is comparing using the ONRM6 wing case implemented in OpenFOAM. It's comparing hierarchical, which is the 3D geometric decomposition method that is hard-coded into OpenFOAM, and the third-party graph decomposition libraries it interfaces with, namely Metis, khipscotch, and ptscotch. So looking at the graph on the left, you can see that the decomposition method used does impact the runtime, with hierarchical generally performing way better than the other methods. And if you look at the profiling, this is because overall hierarchical has lower communication overhead, especially at higher core counts where the scaling starts becoming a bit poor. So as a result of that, hierarchical generally is considered more suitable for mesh generation because it's a geometric decomposition method. In fact, it is also recommended by Amazon Web Services to run Snappy Hex Mesh on their systems using hierarchical decomposition. But the big problem with it is that it needs to be configured mandatorily with the number of subdomains in X, Y, and Z. And there's different ways you can go about this. And in this example, we see how you can decompose across 8 cores in 3 different ways, although there are more, and that can impact the runtime. So again, looking at the runtimes of the NRM6 wing on 8 cores, if you run with 1x4x2, you get almost 76 seconds for run. Just swap the Y and Z, and then it becomes 100, and 1x1x8 is twice as slow as running it with the quickest method. So the configuration of N impacts the runtime. On top of that, hierarchical also has an optional configuration in the form of changing the sorting order from X then Y then Z to Y, Z, X, etc. And the refinement can also be further altered by setting parameters like max load and balance and local cells, which determines how frequently the dynamic load balancing step takes place, and so impacts performance as well. So basically you end up with a lot of very different configurations to offer to the CFD engineer. And this goes in defiance of what is stated in the CFD vision, which is mesh generation should be more invisible to the user. Instead, now you have to spend a lot of time configuring it in order to be able to run it as fast as possible. And because of that, you might want to use something more straightforward like Scotch, one of the third-party methods. But as you can see from the graph earlier, using a different method could result in a loss of resources and time. So then how can we make running hierarchical pretty much as easy as running Scotch or KHIP or one of the other methods? What can we learn from the case setup that can help us in determining what the best decomposition is, the best subdomain allocation is? It turns out even before running mesh generation, you can actually get a lot of information from the case setup itself. You can, from the block mesh dict, you can get things like the initial number of cells, the size of the domain. You can get the geometry's position and size, use surface feature extractor, extract its features. From the snappy hex mesh dict, you can get the feature refinement, service refinement levels, and get how frequently the load balancing might take place from the load unbalance and local cells methods, and the optional refinement region descriptions as well. So how can we combine all of this information from a case setup and then automatically provide a CFD engineer with a ideal subdomain allocation for running in meshing in hierarchical? So when you think of automatic, one of the natural thoughts that come is machine learning. And the great thing here is that many of the case settings from the dict files can easily be tabulated as they're numerical. And decision trees are a gold standard method of working with tabulated data, especially that are about mid-size, around 10,000 samples. They're also a great method to work with as they're relatively simple to understand and set up, and so would work very well for a proof of concept model. Random forest improve on decision trees further as they're a collection of decision trees trained on bootstrap variations of the training data set, and that reduces the risk of overfitting and bias in the results. So we've implemented our proof of concept model using the random forest classifier from scikit-learn. And from that, we aim to predict the best subdomain allocation for hierarchical, i.e. the optimum n in the form of a string of nx, ny, and nz. So before you can even start training a model, you need to create a data set, and to make as general a model as possible, you need to cover a variety of data set, a variety of options in your data set. So we created our proof of concept model with 5 different geometries that cover a variety of different sizes and shapes and features. We also came up with 10 different setups of extremely altering the geometry by moving it around, scaling it, rotating it within the domain. We also changed the size of the domain and the amount of cells it starts with, and changed the refinement levels in the snappy hex mesh dict. And overall, we came up with the 10 different setups that were applied to the 5 different geometries, giving us a total of 50 unique cases. As I said earlier, extracting the information out of the dict files and tabulating that is relatively straightforward. The same can't be said of extracting information from the geometry, but using the Open3D package in Python, we could extract some numerical data to represent the geometry, namely using the oriented bounding box to estimate its length, using the orientation matrix of the bounding box to convert them into your pitch and roll angles to represent the orientation with 3 numbers instead. And its voxelized representation was used to estimate the geometry's volume, and also essentially give a hint on the amount of work that refinement would be doing in each direction. So combining all of this information from the case setup and then actually running the mesh generation gave us our final data set. Each of the 50 cases were run with 81 different runs each, which was based on 9 different random core counts that were chosen randomly to avoid biasing towards commonly used core count numbers. And for each of them, especially for higher core counts, amongst the many different possible subdomain allocations, 9 were randomly chosen each. So with 81 runs per case and 50 cases, we ended up with a data set of 50 samples. But some of the samples that had faces in error in the mesh were dropped as that was not tackled in this specific implementation. Also, the mesh generation was not run fully. It was only focused on refinement, which is the one that performs the most amount of dynamic load balancing. So for each of the case, optimum n was determined by looking at the runtimes across each of the runs of a case, and each of them was assigned optimum n to then be classified to that value. The number of cores was used as a feature in the data set, as was the subdomain allocations, but they were scaled with respect to the cube root of the core to introduce some amount of generalization. To train the model, the random forest model, the best way to go about configuring the model for high level of performance is by using cross-validation to pick up the best the best hyperparameters. So the initial data set was split into training and testing, and then the training data set was then used as cross-validation to determine the hyperparameters. And then selection was also applied to the training and testing data set to then with the selected data, train and then validate the final model. Just looking at the cross-validation tools used, the intermediate model was trained using the repeated stratified k-fold technique, the example which is provided in figure 12. And this was combined with using the randomized search CV, which explored different values within the ranges for the hyperparameters, like the number of trees in the set and the max tree depth, etc. The combination of that gave the best hyperparameters that ensured a maximum accuracy of classification. And extra parameters were also trained using the online weights and biases tool, which included splitting the initial testing and training data set split, the amount of repetitions for the stratified k-fold technique, and also the number of features to be selected from the data set. So when evaluating the random forest model, the first thing to look at would be the feature importances, i.e. the contribution of each of the features at determining the final outcome. And these were the ones that were selected to describe the model, and also had a high impact on the final classification. As you can see here, the number of cores does have a significantly disproportionate amount of importance in comparison to the rest of the settings. This is in part because it does have a significant amount of impact on the runtime, and it is also implicitly tied to the optimum n as it's linked to it. But the other features extracted from the geometry and the case settings also had varying degrees of impact spread across them at the final classification. Just looking at the accuracy as well, we achieved about a 71% accuracy using the data set that we had. This is not necessarily great for a machine learning model, but we do have a very limited scope of data covered and it's a very small data set. So this is fairly promising in that respect. And it is important to note that some of the wrong classifications could have been off by about 40%. So there was a high penalty to their misclassification. But you could expect the accuracy to improve generally by having a much larger data set with more geometries to cover, with much higher variety of subdomain allocations to cover. But I think the most important thing to make the model more general and applicable across and reducing the impact of the number of cores on the runtime is to decouple the number of cores from the final outcome n by turning n into some form of ratio for a multiple. And also and this is to sort of avoid trying to create a model per core count, which is a very tedious and sort of defeats the purpose of it being sort of general. Also, there's a need to sort of determine at what point does the core count, like increasing the core count does not really significantly impact the runtime. And yeah, adding other features such as layering and snapping parameters and incorporating further HPC systems could also make the setup more general. And we could also expand on the setup by using it on other decomposition methods such as k-hip, which also requires a bit of tweaking, or use it to determine parameters like max load and balance. And finally, the random forest classifier is fairly less interpretable in comparison to the decision tree, but there are some methods that can be used to extract more information out of them. So future work could also include doing that and finding more ways to optimize the results. And that's it. Thank you so much.